This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Sunday with Lewis Goodall.
Well, good morning. Very, very good morning to you. You're listening to Sunday with Lewis Goodall on LBC on the 19th of May, 2024. Coming up.
I think that getting back the hostages is the highest priority within the goals of the war.
A key member of Israel's war cabinet sets out a 6-point plan, must have listened to Keir Starmer, for dismantling Hamas and threatens to resign if Netanyahu doesn't adopt a new plan for Gaza. Should the UK government be putting more pressure on Israel's Prime Minister to set out his goals in Rafah? We will discuss with the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps. Plus,
I'm not prepared to do gimmicks. I'm only prepared to do the hard yards of serious change.
a set-piece speech from Sir Keir Starmer fires the starting gun for the general election. This morning, his Shadow Health Secretary provides further details on how Labour would tackle the NHS backlog. Wes Streeting will join us live to discuss.
Call 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. This is LBC.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning on Sunday with Lewis Goodall on LBC. The very best interviews, political analysis for the next 2 hours, analysing and discussing the week just gone in politics and the week to come in the UK and abroad as well. Talking of being abroad, I just basically got in in the early hours from Georgia, reporting on the riots, the protests that are taking place there against the Georgian government. Overwhelmingly young Gen Z protesters. Will be bringing you some of those interviews and some of my thoughts on that a little bit later in the show. For my money, one of the biggest stories that is happening right now, to some extent being a little bit overshadowed by the other massive foreign affairs stories taking place around the world, some of which, of course, I have put to Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, who's our first interview this morning. And really, we had to start the interview with the news from Israel overnight, which again, a big story this. Benny Gantz, some of you may be familiar with, former Defence Secretary for Israel, part of the three-man war cabinet in the Netanyahu government, kind of a political adversary of Netanyahu in normal circumstances, probably usually the only other really plausible prime ministerial candidate. Well, he overnight has threatened to resign unless Netanyahu sets out a post-war plan for the Gaza Strip. He said to Netanyahu, if you put the national over the personal, you will find us partners in the struggle. But if you choose the path of fanatics and lead the entire nation to the abyss, we will be forced to quit the government. So Gantz not mincing his words. And that follows comments from the current Defence Secretary, the incumbent, Yoav Gallant, who has urged this week Netanyahu to state publicly that Israel has no plans to take over civilian and military rule in Gaza. Mr. Gallant has said he raised the issue repeatedly for months, but has received no response. So consider this, we're 9 months into the Israel-Gaza conflict, and basically the world has no idea what the post-war settlement looks like, what the Israeli government's plan is for the post-war settlement. And that is people in the war cabinet, Netanyahu's own war cabinet, who are saying that. I mean, in so many ways, that is an extraordinary state of affairs. I want to get your thoughts on all of this. 0345 6060 973, and how it can be that, given we are where we are 9 months on, that could be the case. Lots of other politics to get through this morning, including lots of domestic politics and the fallout from the infected blood scandal. But moments ago, I spoke to Defence Secretary Grant Shapps, and I started by asking him that precise question. Is there a plan for the post-war situation in Gaza? And if so, has the British government been asking for it and seen it?
Well, I'm very keen to see a plan developed, actually, and my opposite number, the current Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, said the same thing in the week, and I messaged him to say, that's absolutely right. The world does need to know, Gaza needs to know, the Israeli population needs to know, what is the plan for the day after? Because otherwise you're essentially in a battle here against Hamas terrorists, and we respect the fact that Israel has a right to defend itself and was brutally attacked, but you've got to have some hope for the future. You've got to know that Israel doesn't plan to remain there, and actually I think there's a wider plan which in the end could involve getting to normalization in terms of relations with other countries in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia, which could bring a greater peace to the region if the pieces can be put in place. So yes, of course, it's right to have a plan for afterwards, and we're keen to see that.
Has the British government asked for it? asked the Israelis for?
Throughout, actually, and in lots of different ways. So in my conversations, I frequently sort of said, what is the end game? How are you going to make sure that a form of government is established, which is a Palestinian government, but isn't Israel remaining in there, and does mean that people are not in Gaza represented by a bunch of terrorists and Hamas. So that's the challenge.
Have they given you, you say you've asked repeatedly, have they given you any answers?
Well, I think what we're seeing now is, in a sense, is some of that internal debate in Israel, which is, as remember, is unlike in the UK, where governments typically are made up of a single party. It's not just a coalition like the one we had here when the Lib Dems were in coalition. This is a rainbow coalition, so it's extremely complicated.
But can I deduce, Defence Secretary, that they haven't given you an answer, because you say you've asked repeatedly for it. You said
well, of course,
to emerge now. They haven't given you an answer.
You'd know if there was a plan, and there isn't one that we've seen, and we think there should be.
Does that rather put into doubt, or rather call into question, our continued full-throated support for the Netanyahu government in terms of the British
Well, we've
government?
never just...
Because we're basically given them support, which has not been totally unqualified, but it's been pretty full-throated, and yet we don't have any clue on what the post-war situation is going to be, and we're 9 months in.
I just want to correct something there. Our support is not for the Netanyahu government, as you describe it. Our support is for a democratic state, the only one in the Middle East, who have a legitimate right to defend themselves from terrorists who came in and beheaded people, raped them, slaughtered them, kidnapped them, and murdered them.
But in practical terms,
that is very different.
On a day-to-day basis,
well,
that manifests itself in terms of support for the Netanyahu government. I just wonder if you're disturbed by the fact that there doesn't seem to be a plan.
No, I disagree with that. We have very robust conversations where we are very clear on our expectations to ensure that, for example, international humanitarian law is met, that Gaza is, as we suggested to them, and they did use the language for a bit, flooded with aid. And we've seen the United Kingdom's part in ensuring that pier has been driven into Gaza, providing the aid, Britain helping to sort the aid from Cyprus, providing some of it, having the command and control ship RAFA Cardigan Bay in the Mediterranean, and being a big part of providing that. So again, you've said it twice now, and it's not. Our job is not to support the particular government. Our job is about understanding the difference between a democracy that has been attacked and a terrorist organisation who isn't good for their own people or obviously for the region or Israel.
I want to move on to something else, which is, I've just returned from Georgia. You'll of course be aware of the protests that have been taking place there. How concerned are you by what is happening in Georgia, and in particular the question around Russian influence as to what is going on right now?
Extremely. This law that they're trying to pass is not democratic. It's to do with restricting media. It looks like it's under the influence of Putin and Russia. And it reminds us that there is a genuine world battle about the worldview that we think that at this moment in time is absolutely existential to all of our futures. It's one thing for Russia or China or other areas to have autocratic leaders who don't give the public a say, and we don't like it, but in the end it's their internal business. It's completely different when they try to impose that world order on others, and that is a bit of what we're seeing there in Georgia. Georgia's future is towards Europe as a democratic nation, looking towards NATO and European institutions. It's not it's not, I think, looking west. It's not, I think, to the sort of despotism we see come from Putin, who slaughters his political opponents.
I interviewed the leader of the opposition there yesterday, who wants the West, including the UK, to sanction the Prime Minister if he goes ahead with this law, and his billionaire backer, the owner effectively of his party, Inishvili, and the coterie around him. Is that something that you would consider?
Well, it's certainly concerning what's happening there. I don't want to comment on the specifics of that. I haven't gone into the detail there, but I do think that just the future for which actually is a very good future, I think, for a country like Georgia, is to embrace the kind of liberal freedoms that we have in the West, and not to get fooled into taking away power from citizens, which is what all of these things do. And ultimately, we see what happens. You end up in a situation where anyone who wants freedom, like Navalny in Russia, is murdered by the president.
I must ask you about the infected blood scandal, but before we do, just on foreign affairs, just on Ukraine briefly, how confident are you that the Ukrainians are going to be able to repel the attack on Kharkiv that we're seeing right now?
I think they will, ultimately. But I think it's been a massive mistake to have taken our eyes off the ball. And I actually went to Ukraine, to Kyiv, earlier this year and warned that the gap in providing aid was creating a situation where it was quite likely that we would be in a position where some of what we're seeing now with these towns and cities, smaller ones, being taken, ended up being the upshot. So I think that Ukraine can recover this. I think that they likely will recover it. But I also think that we have a collective responsibility to do what the United Kingdom's done throughout, which is to ensure that we continue to give on a regular basis. One of the reasons why the United Kingdom's not only increased the amount of money we're giving, but we've also said that we'll continue to do that every year, to give President Zelensky and the Ukrainians the confidence that when it comes to Britain, you have a rock-solid ally, which is why they consider us as their greatest supporter.
Turning to the infected blood scandal, looks like the Chancellor is going to have a major announcement on this in terms of the compensation. I mean, you've had the recommendation from Sir Brian Langstaff, who has, of course, been heading up the inquiry since July 2022, that the victims and their families should be paid, quotes, without delay. We're nearly 2 years on from that now. Why haven't you acted before now?
Well, I know that this report that will be published tomorrow will, I hope, bring a very significant moment to this absolute scandal of infected blood. In fact, my first contact in terms of constituency casework with this was actually just a couple of weeks ago, when a couple came to me who'd lost their son decades ago, and they showed me the photographs of him. The fact that it's taken decades and decades to get to this point is, of course, absolutely wrong. A big sort of, I'm not sure, well, he'll tell us more, whether it's a cover-up, whether it's a no one quite wanting to give answers, or computer says no attitude, but for whatever reason, this has taken far, far too long. I don't want to preempt. In fact, I don't know what the Chancellor will say, so I have to leave it to that. But I mean,
but one way or the other,
my heart goes out to them all.
Of course, and I'm sure they'll appreciate that. But one way or the other, you talk about it taking decades, and of course, there are big systemic questions for the whole British government and many British governments, not just yours.
No, it's gone back so far.
Absolutely,
yeah.
But your government has had the recommendation from Sir Brian Langstaff since July 2022. He said, and as you know, this was of particular importance because there is someone dying as a result of this scandal once every 4 days. So it would have been good, wouldn't it, if you had simply obeyed that instruction or accepted that instruction 2 years ago, and then roughly 150 people who have died since then would have received compensation before now. So I ask you again, why didn't you do it back in July 2022 when you had the recommendation from him?
Well, as I say, I'm not. My entire contact with this has been as a constituency MP, actually.
Sure, I appreciate that.
One of the things which might be, which is interesting about this, is I was asking them, are there other constituents in Welwyn, Hatfield? I've not been contacted about this before, and they said, no, we don't think there are. And I suspect all of this has taken quite a long time to come to a head because cases are spread across the country. You asked specifically why after that report. Well, I know that there was further work commissioned, and that's the report that we'll see tomorrow. I don't have the detail to provide for you. I've not been. Health Secretary is one of the very few jobs I've not had. So I'm just not close enough to that detail, I'm afraid.
Why do you think it is? We seem to have so many of these scandals, don't we, within the British state of late? Do you think one of the problems, in particular with this one, and some of the details are hair-raising, talking about, doctors conducting experiments on children, all these sorts of things, is one of our problems that we perhaps venerate the NHS too much as an institution, that we think it's sometimes rather above criticism or inquiry?
Yeah, I mean, you say we've had a lot of late. Remember, this is something which goes back decades.
Sure,
I mean,
you don't want to be the post office scandal,
yes.
other than so on.
And I rather hope, that the answer to that is, and take the post office scandal as well, also goes back a long way. I rather hope that the answer is that we are just a lot better at uncovering things. Not we, I mean the nation, the society, and perhaps because of the ability for anyone to speak these days on social media and those types of things, perhaps we're just better at investigating and uncovering these things than we would have been in decades gone by. I also think we have a much better view of what real justice is these days compared with the years gone by, and things which were, oh, never mind, nothing we can do about it. Well, that's not acceptable in today's society. So I suspect there's quite a few societal changes that have led to this finally coming to a head.
Your colleague and former Chancellor of the Exchequer, albeit briefly, Nadhim Zahawi, has told the Sunday Times that he thinks it was a mistake to get rid of Boris Johnson. Do you agree with that?
Well, I was saying it at the time, so I said that 2 years ago. I supported him.
So you agree
right the way,
you still think
right the way through. Well, I mean, you can't go and relitigate what's already happened. But I said it at the time, so it doesn't.
So logically, therefore, you think it would be better if Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister?
Well, it's not what I'm saying now, because so much time has passed in between. I simply make the point that at the time I wasn't saying that he should be chased out. Not because, by the way, he was never he's clearly had many flaws, but I also thought he did some things extremely well, particularly getting that vaccine before other countries.
So you haven't changed your mind, Defence Secretary, about Boris Johnson?
Well, as I say, I think it's impossible to sort of go from what I said 2 years ago, which is very clearly to say I think that we shouldn't
even though Rishi Sunak
is
doing such a good job as Prime Minister.
Well, I think, by the way, I think Rishi has done extraordinary work under very, very difficult circumstances, because if you think about it,
Boris would have done it better.
Well, you're forgetting about what happened in between. There was another change.
Yes, indeed.
I think that I think that Rishi actually has done an extraordinary job under very difficult circumstances, including dealing with the thing we were just talking about. To get back to serious things, Ukraine, the price spikes that came through the energy costs from Putin, and who's managed to get that under control. What government? Well, that's been Rishi's work, and many other things. What's happened in Northern Ireland? Sourcing that situation.
Well, talking about Northern Ireland, just finally,
so I think he's done a great job.
Just talking about Northern Ireland, since you mentioned it, Defence Secretary, just finally, Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris, you'll have seen today, MP for Daventry, has said that he's going to be standing down at the next election. It's rather a flood, isn't it? What would you say to your colleagues, all of these people deciding to step down? You're sticking around, I assume. I am indeed, absolutely. Well, there's a relief.
Look, people serve in government and in public service. He's done nearly a quarter of a century, because I think he was an MEP when we were in Europe.
There are a lot of them
before he became an MP.
There are a lot of them, an unusual number. It does rather suggest that your colleagues aren't too confident about the future.
No, I don't think it's actually statistically true. You always get more from the governing side, because you have a lot more MPs, for one thing, and there may be vagaries of the fact that when people got elected, but 25 years, you don't think I should?
No, I'm just saying there's a lot more than the last election. I mean, there's a lot. You can't seriously think, Defence Secretary, that there aren't a lot of MPs deciding to call it a day.
Well, as I say, actually, interestingly, and I have taken the time to look at the figures in a bit more detail, on average, at the end of a full 5 years, remember the last Parliament was only 2 years, so of course you're going to have more after a full 5-year Parliament, so that's different for one thing. But
anyway, it's not
particularly unusual.
Would you say your colleagues stick around because the future is going to be great?
Yeah, I'd say it's an overwritten story, and I think that anyone who thinks that the election is in the bag, and the person who thinks that most, of course, is Keir Starmer, is taking the public for granted and taking everyone for fools. We have a democracy, an election to get through first.
Grant Shapps there, the Defence Secretary, Tory MP, of course, for Welwyn. Hatfield saying he, unlike at least quite a few of his colleagues, and I think he would accept, actually, with the figures, that there are quite a few of his colleagues, he is sticking around for the general election. Who knows? Maybe he'll be leader after the next election. We'll have to wait and see. Lots to get through in terms of what he said in that interview about Ukraine, about Israel, about Georgia, and about infected blood. If you have any thoughts on any of those things, especially infected blood, and we are going to be talking to a victim of that horrendous scandal a little bit later in the show. Want your thoughts? 0345 60 60 973, text 84850. And we'll be getting the thoughts on all of that and more with our eminent and august political editor here on LBC, Natasha Clark. For now, though, Lewis Goodall here on LBC Sunday with Lewis Goodall, and the time is 10:23.
This is LBC with Lewis Goodall.
to Sunday with Lewis Goodall. Let's get the thoughts now of our very own political editor, Natasha Clark. Natasha, hello to you, morning to you. Grant Shapps on pretty robust form there, I thought. The stuff he was talking about Israel, I mean, I do still find it quite remarkable that we're in a situation where we're 9 months into this war and the British government basically accepted, as he did there, that as far as they know, there is no plan for the reconstruction or what the peace plan would be, and they don't really have a means of obtaining one.
Morning, Lewis. Yes, that's exactly the takeaway that I had from that interview that you did with Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, just a few minutes ago. And actually, that was really interesting because that's exactly what David Cameron was saying around sort of a week or so ago when he gave what many thought was his first foreign policy speech in the job. And he was asked about our unqualified, as some see it, support for Israel, and said that if he did, that he did want to see a plan coming out of Israel, out of the Israel government, if they were to go and do any form of offensive in Rafah, they would need to see a plan. And it seems like there is a bit of a concerted effort going on from the West to try and not give Israel an out, but to try and essentially pile the pressure on them to try and shape a little bit of what they are doing in the region. And obviously the news that you were speaking about with him overnight about Benny Gantz, the member of Israel's war cabinet, is quite, I think, shocking news to the international community, that one person out of his 3-strong war cabinet can be essentially putting forward a rival plan for government. It's not like you'd see Oliver Dowden or Grant Shapps calling up and saying, Rishi Sunak, you need to do this, otherwise I'm going to quit. Yeah. So it is quite...
Yeah, it's not like the summer of 2022 or anything like that.
Exactly. It's quite extraordinary. And Grant Shapps says he does want to see a new plan. So there does seem to appear to be that concerted effort from the international community to try and give them a reason to support that further action, but equally as well to pile that pressure on them to change course.
And thinking about domestic politics, Natasha, I mean, it's clear that tomorrow, at the very least, always hard to sort of chart exactly where we'll be by the end of the week in British politics, but it seems clear that tomorrow, at the least, bar some unexpected emergency, is going to be dominated by the sort of political fallout from the infected blood scandal, which has obviously run on and on in one form or another for many decades, but has been sort of glacial in terms of the progress politically. It's a big moment from Jeremy Hunt, isn't it?
It will be a big moment for the government and for the inquiry, which was ordered back in, I think, 2017 by Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, who obviously saw exactly what had been happening and realised the scale of this scandal that had affected tens of thousands of people over so many years. And a bit like so many issues in British politics, no one had really failed to grasp the nettle and actually deal with it. And I think we will see Rishi Sunak make an apology and a statement in the House of Commons tomorrow as the final results of this inquiry come out. And like Jeremy Hunt's been speaking about in the Sunday Times, he is expected to announce a full compensation package. Now, the government have already accepted the need for this. They were waiting for this final inquiry result before they announced what exactly that would be like. And I think you will hear a lot from the victims tomorrow about their long wait for justice. And Grant Shapps has said, the fact that it's taken decades to get there is absolutely wrong. And he sort of hinted that nobody had wanted to take responsibility for such a difficult, thorny issue. And obviously, we are expecting Jeremy Hunt to potentially make another fiscal statement before the next election.
And it has that 10 billion, I mean, it's estimated to be a 10 billion price tag. I mean, that is big potatoes politically and fiscally, and potentially will have an impact. OK, it should just be reasonably a one-off payment, although there will be implications going forward as well. But it could have big implications for the party's spending plans. Yes and no, Lewis. I think what I've been told is essentially because it will be not day-to-day spending, it will be capital spending. To get around the government's fiscal rules, they probably will be able to borrow for it without bending any of their rules. So that might not. No, so long term it won't, but shorter term, it's still it will show up on the balance sheet for the next year. That does have an effect. 10 billion. Yes, I think there is the people in government that feel that it's not going to have too much of an impact on what the government wants to do ahead of the next election in terms of cutting taxes. You heard Jeremy Hunt speaking on Friday about his wish, if the fiscal situation allows, to continue to do that. I think he will essentially kick the can down the road by saying, look, we're going to borrow for this money. It's a bit of a special circumstance. So I think that's how the government will get around that one. We should talk about Labour briefly. Obviously, this has been the week of Keir's first steps. Very exciting. What's the general feeling, do you think, about how they don't want to call it a pledge card, do they? But the 6 pledges have gone down.
I'll be holding on to my pledge card, Lewis. I think it's going to be a
collector's item.
It will be a collector's
Vintage.
item. I remember clearing out some old desks at work once and finding a 2001 style pledge card from Tony Blair, and I don't know where it's gone, but I really wish I'd held on to it because I do feel that these things can.
We were a bit young for that, surely, at the time. Even us, even you and I, political geeks, as I'm sure we were in 2001, probably a little bit young for the old pledge card treatment.
Yes, definitely. But I do think it's something that kind of sticks in the eyes of people. And I think the Team Labour knew exactly what they were doing this week when they were unveiling this Tony Blair-style pledge card.
Although Wes Streeting struggled a little bit this morning, I think.
He has. Wes Streeting on a rival broadcaster this morning has struggled to name all six. And to be honest with you, I kind of don't blame him, actually.
Should be 5. 6 is a bad number.
It should be 5. I know I honestly last week kept saying 5 rather than 6 and kept messing it up.
No one ever has a 6-point plan.
Well, yes, exactly. And antisocial behaviour, as important as it is, has not really been something that the Labour Party have focused on as much recently. And obviously putting things like they're not stopping the boat, their border command at the front of their electoral offering, I think it will help to really narrow down what the Labour Party are trying to do. And they'll be able to point to these 6 steps as something very tangible. But there will be a lot of people saying we're still waiting for that devil in the detail from Sir Keir Starmer, from the Labour Party, before we can make our cross in the box. It's a good first step towards the first steps, but I think a lot of people will be asking for more.
Natasha Clark there, LBC's political editor, giving us her thoughts on the developments of the morning and the politics of the week to come. You're listening to Sunday with Lewis Goodall on LBC. Coming up.
My dad's never met none of his grandchildren, great-grandchildren, never will. So personally, no matter what the report says, he can never change nothing. That's the thing about it.
That was Scott Corns, who lost his father and 3 uncles after they were infected with HIV and hepatitis C. Now the government promised a compensation package for those impacted by the infected blood scandal. We will be joined live by Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, right after this. For now, though, it's at 10:32. Let's get the very latest LBC news headlines with Jenny Barsby.
This is LBC with Lewis Goodall.
35, listening to Sunday with Lewis Goodall. We're going to be talking very shortly to the Shadow Health Secretary. Tweeted this morning that he's a health secretary, perhaps been getting a little bit ahead of myself. The Shadow Health Secretary was streeting about his party's plans to cut NHS waiting lists, and of course we'll have seen whether or not he's learned the 6 pledges by the time he talks to me. Let's talk first, though, to Sean, who is in Diss in Suffolk. Sean.
Hi, Lewis. I think the Israelis have already got a plan. Their plan is to remove all the indigenous people, the Palestinians, from Gaza, ethnically cleanse them. Either send them into Egypt, send them over here, or... Well,
Egypt won't take them, Sean, so even if that's the plan, that's not going to work. But I mean, obviously, I should say that the Israeli government would dispute that. They would say that they have no plans to ethnically cleanse anyone. Other people make another decision, but that's what they would say.
Well, excuse my lying eyes, I can see that well over 30,000 of them have been ethnically cleansed already.
That will include some Hamas terrorists, of course.
A tiny amount of Hamas terrorists.
Oh, we don't know. What we do know is lots of civilians have been killed, wounded, maimed. Yes. There's no doubt about that.
Yes, and speaking of Hamas terrorists, you never hear of the PLO, do you? That's because Netanyahu, not his real name, if you look at his Wikipedia, you'll get his real name, has sent many millions of pounds to Hamas in order to drive a wedge between Hamas and the PLO. And this Frankenstein monster...
Well, the PLO doesn't quite exist anymore. Of course, it's Fatah now. But yes, the sort of successor of the PLO, Fatah, yeah.
So it just shows how long Netanyahu has been doing this sort of thing. But no, we've killed, or they have killed... Well,
what do you think we should do, Sean? Is there anything we can do? I mean, you may have heard the Grant Shapps talking to me a little bit earlier on, saying, well, the British government isn't aware of any plan. What do you think? Is there anything we can do, the British government can do?
Well, that Grant Shapps, what a lightweight. You had him on the ropes there about the blood. He managed to wiggle off that there. No, Grant Shapps, as part of our government, is an active participant in this slaughter in Gaza. If he's not careful in like 10 or 20 years' time, he may be hauled off to The Hague.
Well, I don't think that you can say that although the British government, you might argue, is doing far, far too little in terms of trying to ameliorate the suffering of the people there. I'm not sure we can say that Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, would be guilty of war crimes personally.
Well, and another thing they're doing, they're sending our money to Ukraine, a complete lost cause.
Why is it a lost cause? Well, you think we should just let the Russians just roll into Kharkiv and Kyiv, do you?
Well, when did the killing start? The killing didn't start
in 2022, February 2022, and then before that in 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea.
No, that's not when the killing started.
Well, when did it start?
The killing started when the Ukrainians shelled the eastern part of Ukraine.
So it's the Ukrainians fought the war.
14,000. That's how many they killed.
Yeah, this is Kremlin. This is Kremlin talking point, Sean. I mean, honestly, this is the sort of missing. I've spent the week in Georgia, which is awash with Kremlin misinformation and propaganda, and I am genuinely worried about its proliferation, not just in that country, but in our country. I'm afraid that in what you've just said, you've once again demonstrated why I'm right to be worried. Thanks, Sean. Enough of that, I think. People will be familiar when I did my Friday show, if you listened to me then. I will tolerate many things on this show, but I do not want to hear Kremlin propaganda. The idea that the war in Ukraine is anyone else's fault other than Vladimir Putin is absurd. You can have a big structural debate about NATO enlargement or whatever, although what I would say is that the thing that always misses, as I say, I've just been in Georgia and I did loads of tweeting and reporting for the News Agents podcast, out now. You can go and listen to it. We'll be playing a little bit later on in this show. With so many young people, so many young people, 18, 19, 20 students, all out every single night demonstrating remarkable bravery, protesting against their government, saying that they want a better future, a European future. They don't want a Russian future. That is their choice. That is self-determination. And the number of people, bots mainly, but also just people who I think frankly should know better, who are tweeting back saying things like, well, self-determination is achieved through the barrel of a gun, or accusing them of being CIA stooges or whatever it happens to be. No, this is about self-determination. This is what it's about. That's what it's about in Georgia. That's what it was about in the states of Eastern Europe who've joined NATO in the EU. And that's what it's about in Ukraine. And the number of people, particularly sometimes on the left, I have to say, who seem to have a problem with the idea of self-determination, but it's not just the left, it can be the far right as well, is absolutely extraordinary to me. Or seem to be willing to just sit and be armchair generals and just say, well, no, these countries have to accept that they're in the Russian sphere of influence. No. You may have noticed that there aren't a great, massive, for all of the West problems, which are manifold and many and hypocrisy and all sorts of other things. What you can say is there is not a massive queue of people lining up to join Club Russia or Club China. And for all of the West problems and all the problems of liberal democracy, that does tell its own tale. And I find it extraordinary, the number of people who simply aren't willing to recognise that or see it. We'll get more thoughts on that a little bit later on, though. We should return to domestic politics, though. And, of course, Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary and Social Care Secretary, we should say, Labour MP for Ilford North. We said he was coming, and indeed, he joins us now. Wes, have you been off learning your 6 pledges? Is that the delay?
Oh, Don't even go there. Don't even go there.
What are they? Sorry, just remind me, what are they? What are they? Just remind me.
Deliver economic stability, cut NHS waiting times, launch a new border security command, crack down on antisocial behaviour, set up Great British Energy, and recruit 6,500 teachers. And you know, the annoying thing is, I knew that question would come up this morning. You spend time preparing for it, and then in the moment, I had a total brain freeze.
Look, 5 out of 6.
I am kicking myself harder than Keir Starmer's going to kick me on Monday.
But 5 out of 6 ain't bad, is it? And you know, what's antisocial behaviour? Although I see that.
Well, you know, I was going to say what an upgrade you are on David Lammy, but now you've been mean to me. You can forget it. Bring back Lammy. That's what I say.
Yeah, well, indeed. Hashtag. Anyway, we should talk a little bit about the health service in the NHS. You've got a interview in the Telegraph, I think, today, where you are saying that you want to hospitals are going to be asked to share staff pool waiting lists as part of a £1.1 billion drive to provide an extra 40,000 appointments a week. Tell us a bit more about this.
So NHS waiting lists are at record highs, and in order to cut waiting lists, we're going to use an approach that's been tried and tested at a very small number of hospitals, including the London hospital I can see from my office window, and make that facility available to patients right across the country. That will be an extra £1.1 billion going into the pockets of NHS staff to deliver clinics at evenings and weekends, to get people off those waiting lists through diagnostic tests and treatments so we can cut the backlog. We're also going to be pooling waiting lists across regions, so we make best use of staff capacity and also the facilities, operating theatres, scanners, and doing that, I think we will make a real difference, and quite quickly as well. I mean, we can get 40,000 appointments up and running within the first year of a Labour government. So, having those 40,000 extra appointments every week, more than 2 million a year, will make a real difference.
You've also said the NHS is over-reliant on migrant workers. What is Labour going to do to change that?
We're going to deliver the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history. So we start training our own homegrown talent and reduce reliance on overseas migration for a few key reasons. I mean, firstly, we are recruiting as a country from red list countries that are identified by the World Health Organization as having real shortages. So I think that is unethical and immoral, actually. Secondly, we are turning away thousands of straight A students from studying medicine at university, which seems crazy and unfair to them. And thirdly, there is a global shortage of healthcare workers. So in terms of thinking about Britain's long-term security in terms of health and care workforce, we shouldn't assume that pool of international workers will always be there to draw on, because there is a global shortage. And so to make sure we mitigate against that risk, I want to make sure we're training our own homegrown talent. The NHS will always have an international workforce, yes, and I'm proud of the fact it does, actually, but we've got to make sure we're getting the proportion right.
Do you think that, in general, migration is too high?
I think net migration levels are too high, and I think it is having an impact, particularly in terms of housing pressures, for example. And I certainly see that as a MP on the London-Essex border. Again, you want to make sure from around the world that is the beating heart of the global economy. And so people coming to work here from overseas, to study here from overseas especially, has brought real benefits to our country. But I think we've got to view migration in that nuanced way of recognising that there are benefits, there are also challenges, and at the moment net migration is running at record highs. And I think I can help Yvette Cooper as the Home Secretary bring some of those numbers down by making sure we're not over-reliant on health and care workers from overseas.
But I mean, sometimes there is a trade-off, isn't there? I mean, if it is a case that, and I've got the dilemma, at least in the short term, where it's a case of, do we bring waiting lists down and thereby recruit more people from abroad, at least in the short term, or focus on net migration? There's a trade-off. Which would the Labour government prioritise?
Yeah, and I think that we're going to take a balanced approach. But I mean, one of the things that I'm really gobsmacked by this week is this speculation that the government is going to clamp down on universities recruiting international students, which I think would be such an extraordinary act of national self-harm, because international students come to the UK, they pay significant fees that help to subsidise education for British students and research in our universities. They also contribute to the UK in the longer term, because the amount of soft power this country has around the world, both in terms of business and diplomacy, because we've got people who've come to the UK, spent some of their formative years in their late teens and 20s in Britain. They then go back to countries they came from, become leaders in business and politics and other areas, and they retain a real affection for this country. So I think the government's got to tread very carefully on this, because if they start just clamping down on universities recruiting international students, they'll do real harm to the anemic economic growth we see under this government.
We should turn to the infected blood scandal. I mean, just on a point of information briefly, assuming Jeremy Hunt announces, as we are told he's going to do, there's going to be £10 billion in compensation, that will be matched pound for pound by a Labour government.
We're going to back him. I must say, it's not often I pick up a Sunday paper, see something the Chancellor said and breathe a huge sigh of relief in a good way, because the victims of this scandal have been waiting for so long for justice. And there's a real human tragedy of unspeakable proportions in this, in that every 4 days another one of those victims dies without justice or compensation. So time is of the essence. And I was beginning to really worry that we were going to get to this week, the publication of Sir Brian Langstaff's landmark report, and then he was going to long grass it and say, oh, this will be for the other side of the general election, when those families, I don't think, can wait. So if
you want it paid
immediately, and I expect he will, Well, if he does the right thing this week, and I expect he will, we'll be supporting him in that. So I think, given that this is a scandal that straddles successive governments, Labour-led and Conservative-led governments, I think it would be fitting, actually, if we came together to solve this problem. And I think the Chancellor will do the right thing and will support him.
To be clear, but you want it to be immediate. You don't want it to say that this is going to, again, go in terms of the funding, take place after the general election, or just give a pledge. You want it to happen now.
I think the sooner the better. And the government said, well, we're waiting for the publication of the final report. Well, that's this week. So, I hope that they're ready and able to act. And if they do, we will absolutely support them in that, because it is the right thing to do. And if Jeremy Hunt only does one thing between now and the general election, let it be this. I think these families have gone through an unbearable tragedy. Yeah. It's been a disaster, frankly, and I think they deserve that justice and that compensation.
Do you think that, in terms of looking at the long sweep of where this scandal has come from and the origins of it, is one of the factors? I'm sure it would just be one, but one of the factors. Is there an element where, frankly, we venerate the NHS a little bit too much and don't ask the tough questions sometimes when we need to?
Yes. And that's why I've been brutally honest about the state of the NHS, making it clear it is a service, not a shrine. It is not the envy of the world. It's not just on its knees, it's on its face. And it needs serious reform and modernisation. Otherwise, it's not going to be there for us in the future. And I'm absolutely determined to make sure that we have that culture of honesty and openness, because if you can't be honest about the problem, how can you be trusted to solve it?
Just briefly on Israel, I mean, you might have seen the news overnight about Benny Gantz basically saying that he'll pull out of the government of Israel if there is no plan, because as far as he's seen, there is no plan for the post-war settlement. Shouldn't we be rethinking our commitment, which generally speaking as a government, Parliament has been pretty committed to the Netanyahu government, or giving it quite a bit of support? Isn't it amazing, extraordinary, that we're 9 months in and we haven't got any plan at all about what the post-war situation might look like? And even Benny Gantz is saying it.
Yeah, I mean, look, without wanting to wade into internal politics of Israel, I think it is a reminder to us that there are many, many voices in Israel, within the government and on the streets of Israel, who want to see the security of the Israelis guaranteed and the hostages returned, but are also looking to a future of peaceful coexistence with the Palestinians. And it has been the long-standing policy of the Labour Party and actually our country to support a two-state solution, a state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel. The way in which this war has been conducted in terms of the number of civilian lives lost, innocent lives lost, has been appalling. And we have been critical in the Labour Party of that. And we want to see a ceasefire, we want to see the return of the hostages, and we want to see the international community rally to put in place a serious peace process so that out of the darkness of this war, we can have the peaceful future for both Israelis and Palestinians that they deserve.
Notable, well, just finally, when I was joshing you about the 6 pledges and what's on it, what's not on it, notable perhaps that the plan around workers' rights isn't on it.
There are lots of things we're committed to that aren't on the card, and that doesn't mean we're any less committed to them. I don't.
But you'll know that there is concern from some, particularly within trade unions, about a potential dilution of Angela Rayner's plan for workers' rights. I mean, you can say that's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. And look, this isn't just Angela Rayner's plan. This is the Labour Party's plan, and we are committed to it because, this is good for, good economy relies on good working conditions for its people. And I think what we've set out in terms of the New Deal for working people won't just be good for workers, it will be good for the economy overall. And we are committed to that. This has gone through the sausage machine of the Labour Party policy-making process, like one of those things you don't want to see made, laws and sausages. We've been through that process.
So it's still going to be the first 100 days? Because that was the previous commitment, wasn't it? Within the first 100 days of a Labour government, it's going to happen within the first 100 days.
I think it'll be certainly an early priority. In terms of
not necessarily the first 100
I think
days.
the challenge is some of what we want to do is quite complicated legislatively. So yes, we'll want to move quickly.
But Angela Rayner had said before it would be the first 100 days. So perhaps there is not a dilution of the content, but maybe in terms of the timeline.
No, I don't. I'm not sure about that, to be honest. It's probably best to ask Angela. But I would be very surprised if we don't see movement on this very quickly within the first 100 days. But in terms of getting things like legislation through, that can take longer. But I think you can expect to see, the New Deal for working people out the traps very early.
Angela Rayner in October 2023, Angela Rayner said Labour will implement its plans to bolster workers' rights within 100 days of taking office. So you're saying perhaps not 100 days.
Well, I think we'll certainly get the ball rolling within the first 100 days. I'm just thinking in a really practical sense about how quickly you get legislation through within the first 100 days. But it will be an early priority, and being no doubt about the strength of feeling on this across the Labour Party and across the shadow cabinet. I think what Angela Rayner has outlined is a transformational programme for working people in this country. Our economy, the success of our economy is built on the backs of working people. We are the party of working people. We are there to champion the interests of working people, and that is what the Labour government will do with the New Deal for working people if people give us that mandate at the general election, which I hope they will.
Wes Streeting there, Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary, giving us his thoughts on his plans on the NHS, Israel, workers' rights and more besides. You are listening to Sunday with Lewis Goodall on LBC, coming up after 11.
We want freedom, and we want just Georgian people all together, Russia.
It's an uncertain future for Russia after its parliament passes the controversial foreign agent law. I've been speaking to protesters in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. That is in the next hour. It's Lewis Goodall here on LBC. The time's 10:55.
This is LBC with Lewis Goodall.
Let's talk to Abdul, who is in Ilford. Abdul.
Hi, Lewis.
Hello. Morning.
Yes, morning. So as far as Gaza is concerned, the thing is, look, Netanyahu has had a plan from before. If you look at the Greater Israel map that he held up in the UN, showing Greater Israel without any Palestinians, without Palestine, this is the plan has been there from 1948. The plan, you look it up. They've already had this plan, and in fact, the Likud party. Sorry, one second. I've got my granddaughter here. Sorry, the Likud party. The Likud party constitution states there is only from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, there is only Israeli sovereignty. It states in the constitution. So basically, this plan has always been there. Now they're enacting it out, regardless of taking the lives of innocent men, women, babies, children, expectant mothers. They don't care about human life. That's the bottom line. And the problem is, UK and US are complicit in these war crimes that are being committed continuously on a daily basis. This is absolutely appalling. The UK and the US have no right to lecture anybody on human rights or morality anymore. We're completely fed up. I think the world is completely outraged at the goings-on and the complicity of our governments in this mass murder. Call it genocide, call it what you want, but it's totally 101% totally unacceptable. We will not, and the majority of the world can see exactly what is going on, but the problem is the governments, the people in power, they just want to be complicit with whatever Israel does. And if it was any other country in the world who did what Israel is doing, we would have been bombing that country by now.
There will be people listening to what you're saying, Abdul, who will vehemently agree with you. There'll be others who think that what you're saying does not address the real fact of Israel's security problems, which were exemplified by October the 7th. What would you say to that argument?
That is ludicrous, because you see, it's not just one day. Palestinians didn't wake up one day and say, "Oh, let's go into Israel now." It doesn't happen.
Well, of course, most Palestinians didn't. Most Palestinians wouldn't want to. It's, of course, Hamas.
But regardless, the thing is, Lewis, I mean, I don't know if you recall Malcolm X when he stated, this is decades back. I'm talking about 3 decades before even Hamas were around, right? And he was stating as well, and one short sentence, the Palestinian struggle is not just a cry for justice, it's a blistering battle for the most fundamental human rights that every living soul on this planet should be inherited by birthright.
Abdul, I'm so sorry to cut you off. I could talk to you all day, and I'm sure we'll talk again, but it is 11 o'clock, and we should just say, coming up on the next hour of the show, lots more to come. We're going to be talking to the German ambassador. We're going to be talking to a trade union leader who I think might have something to say about what Wes Streeting just said there about Angela Rayner's plan and perhaps not happening in the first 100 days after all. And we'll have my exclusive reporting from Tbilisi, Georgia, and the protests that are happening there. For now, though, on LBC and indeed everywhere else, the time's 11:01.
This is LBC with Lewis Goodall.
around 11:04. Thanks so much for joining us here on Sunday with Lewis Goodall. We're going to be turning our attention to domestic politics now, in the main at least, and particularly because, of course, you will know that this has been a big week for the Labour Party as part of the ongoing slow glacial march towards the general election. Labour has, people say it's firing the starting gun. I think we've fired many starting guns. The air is replete with starting gun bullets for this general election. But they've started this week, obviously, unveiling the pledge card in a way. They don't like calling it that. It's all a little bit too reminiscent of the run-up to 97, although no reason they wouldn't like that. But they are saying, Keir Starmer's my first steps for change. Note the use of my, the personal word there, my, rather than Labour Party's steps or my shadow cabinet steps or whatever it happens to be. My first steps from Keir Starmer. And the 6 pledges were as follows. 1, deliver economic stability. 2, cut NHS waiting times. 3, launch a new border security command. Set up Great British Energy. Crack down on antisocial behaviour. Recruit 6,500 new teachers. And of course we should say, look, this is a marketing thing. This is an advertising thing. This is a thing about, in an era where, people's attention spans can be as short as 2 or 3 seconds on TikTok or Twitter or whatever it happens to be. This is at least something that shadow cabinet ministers can take to the airwave and repeat time and time again, as Wes Streeting found to his cost this morning. But just thinking about them a little bit, and it isn't, of course, the full suite of what Labour will do. It's just 6 pledges, but if you think about them, they are rather, you can make an argument, they're quite small beer, right? 1, deliver economic stability. Well, you can have an economically stable, bad economy. So in a sense, just economic stability rather than, full employment or growth at a certain level, whatever it happens to be. Can argue, bit small beer. 2, cut NHS waiting times. It would be remarkable if over the course of the next 4 years, 5 years, they didn't come down as you got rid of the COVID backlog, or at least started to get your way through it. If they went up, my word, we really would be in trouble. 3, launch a new border security command. Well, okay. New Quango, maybe it'll be good, maybe it won't. 4, set up Great British Energy, one of the more interesting ones, but still there's some arguments about whether that's a bit nebulous and exactly what it would do. 5, crack down on antisocial behaviour. Okay, how? 6, recruit 6,500 new teachers, the most concrete one. And you could just say that maybe you could argue that in an era of universal cynicism, actually having smaller pledges rather than bigger pledges is a good thing. But then, is it really a programme for government? That will, of course, come with the manifesto. But these 6, I think even by comparison to the 97 ones, I think you can argue are slim pickings for the Labour Party and for people potentially getting excited about a Labour government. And add into that something I was asking about Wes Streeting just now, which is one of the more radical elements of the Labour Party programme, which is this New Deal for Workers, which has been very much the brainchild, the baby of the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner. And there are all sorts of rumours swirling at the moment about tense union meetings between Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, Rayner herself, and about the potential diminution or dilution of at least some of these measures. Luminaries like Peter Mandelson saying that they should be diluted or pulled back from. And indeed, there's a story in the Times today talking about when Angela Rayner and Rachel Reeves discussed Labour's working rights and trade union reforms last week, there was a point of friction that said everything about the party's political arc under Keir Starmer, talking about pointed exchanges between different shadow ministers and about the plan itself. And you will have heard there Wes Streeting suggesting that when Angela Rayner said it would be in the first 100 days, this plan to beef up, to strengthen workers' rights, maybe it won't be in the first 100 days. We're still committed to it, but maybe it'll be a little bit later on, which has been the direction of travel. I want to talk to you about what you think about Labour's announcements this week and whether it gives you much excitement for the prospect of a Labour government. 0345 6060 973 0345 6060 973, text 84850. Let's talk now to Dave Ward, who's General Secretary of the Communication Workers Union. Dave, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Are you concerned about a potential dilution of the workers' plan?
Yeah, good morning, Lewis. I actually thought we was going to talk about the future of Royal Mail today. I thought that's what you was going to ask me.
Well, we can talk about that, of course, but I just thought, given it's the news of the day.
Let's make sure we do talk about that. But look, my view is that, I was in the meeting. It was a good meeting. We reached an understanding on how we're going to move it forward. Whatever people say, this will be the most transformational package for working people in this country that we've seen in decades. I think where Labour are, not in a place that I would want them to be, in the sense of I think they need to be more ambitious, but they're clearly setting out a strategy to win the middle ground, win back the red wall seats. And I think that's going to be their strategy. But this will be in the manifesto. and it doesn't need to be watered down. There will be aspects of it definitely delivered in the first 100 days of a government.
Is it
new government?
Is that 100 days? Is it important to you that it is legislated for and implemented within 100 days, as Angela Rayner had previously said?
Yeah, that's what we've agreed.
Right.
We agreed that back in July. And, leaked documents and all this sort of stuff. I'm not really that interested in that. I'm interested in what we've agreed.
Yeah.
Clearly, there'll be consultation on the law as such. That happens with every law.
Of course. Well, let me just play you this clip that I've just discussed with Wes Streeting about exactly this matter. Just listen to this.
I think it'll be certainly an early priority. In terms of
not necessarily first.
I think the challenge is some of what we want to do is quite complicated legislatively. So yes, we'll want to move quickly.
Because Angela Rayner had said before it would be the first 100 days. So perhaps there is it not a dilution of the content, but maybe in terms of the timeline.
No, I'm not sure about that, to be honest. It's probably best to ask Angela, but I would be very surprised if we don't see movement on this very quickly within the first 100 days. But, in terms of getting things like legislation through, that can take longer. But I think you can expect to see, the New Deal for working people out the traps very early.
Angela Rayner, in October 2023, Angela Rayner said Labour will implement its plans to bolster workers' rights within 100 days of taking office. So you're saying perhaps not 100 days?
Well, I think we'll certainly get the ball rolling within the first 100 days. I'm just thinking in a really practical sense about how quickly you get legislation through within the first 100 days. But it will be an early priority, and being no doubt about the strength of feeling on this.
So you're saying it's been agreed, Dave, but it doesn't sound like Wes Streeting's got the memo there.
Well, Wes wasn't in the meeting, was he? But look, he makes a point about writing up legislation and how you take that through Parliament, and that's an important point. That isn't straightforward, so there has to be, quite a complex set of writing up of that legislation. It's very comprehensive legislation. But look, the important point is that this is, it's not about having rows between trade unions and the Labour Party. It's about what the Labour Party are going to do if they get elected. And we're going to go out and we're going to make it clear, what this constitutes undoubtedly is a major shift back towards the rights of working people in this country. And I think there's an imbalance at the moment, an imbalance in the economy and an imbalance in the world of work. And if we really want to grow the economy, we have to do better on workers' rights. And I think Labour will deliver that.
What would your message to Peter Mandelson be, who's called for the dilution of the plan?
Well, Peter's, that's up to Peter Mandelson. I've got no message really for Peter Mandelson. I'm interested in what Labour are going to do now and the people who are elected to do that, not people who sit behind the scenes commenting on it from years ago. That's up to them. They got their view. I have a different view.
Let's talk a little bit about the Royal Mail. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has said the UK will look at the national security implications of a bid for the Royal Mail by the Czech billionaire Daniel Kretinsky. Are you concerned?
Well, we're hugely concerned about these developments. I think the whole country should be concerned about these developments because Royal Mail is a public service. It's got 500 years of history. It's a British institution, as British as you can get. And it's about to be sold to an overseas investor in its entirety. But I'm going to tell it as it is and tell it on the basis of what postal workers will be saying. There's no way that we can support the current board of Royal Mail. They've grossly mismanaged the company. They've failed their customers. They've failed the workforce. They've got no plan for the future. What we're going to do is call for a new ownership model, Royal Mail, new business model, probably linked to some of the thinking that's set out in the New Deal for Workers. But we want to engage with the prospective owner as well. They've reached out to us. They've written to us last week. They want to meet us. We've got lots of questions. We want extensive guarantees from them. We have to live in the real world. And my view is this will go through because the government, the guarantees the government are asking for will be given. People, need to realise that they're not looking at this as much as they should be.
Just explain, Dave. What's the nature exactly of your objections? What do you think could happen?
Well, our objections are equal with the current board as they are with a prospective new owner. Our objections would be that they break up the whole of the company, they sell off various bits of it, so Royal Mail no longer is an end-to-end distribution service, that there's no plans for growing the business, that they take the pension surplus, which sits at around about £1.4 billion. So we've got
asset stripping.
Asset stripping in a nutshell. But look, some of the things I've read and some of the things that you hear commentators talking about, Mr. Kretinsky and his group seem to be giving guarantees. Well, the union want to hear those guarantees. We want to really sort of have, extensive discussions about the future. Are they going to invest in the workforce? Are they going to invest in new services? Are they going to invest in the company, or are they going to asset strip? All I'm saying, Lewis, is that the government need to do more under the National Security Investigation and Investment Act than just what Kemi Badenoch said the other day. They will get all of the guarantees, and the government know that. They're just going through a superficial exercise at the moment. We're going to have a serious debate in the UK about the future of Royal Mail.
Given that this is so close now to the general election, I mean, do you think it would be a good idea to just simply defer this decision until after the general election?
Well, the problem with that is, as we understand the takeover code of companies in the UK, this will be done and dusted in terms of the deal by 14 days. At that point, in the weeks after that, then the government are the only body that can intervene under the National Security Investigation and Investment Act. And we will expect them to do that in a very robust way. At the same time, we will be having conversations with and discussions with the prospective buyers.
I mean, it's a big deal, isn't it, Dave? Because obviously, the Royal Mail, it's a 500-year-old company. It's a key bit of British infrastructure. It would be a very big deal if it were sold to a foreign owner.
I think it's a massive moment for the future of, it's another one of these times when things that were very British, that served the country very well and still does, if it had good leadership from the board, which it doesn't have at the moment, then it can still have a bright future. And people should be concerned about this. The whole of the UK should be concerned. But in saying that, the real answer is to bring in a new business model where the workers and customers who rely on services and the workers who provide those services have a greater say over the direction of the company. And that's what we'll be arguing for.
I mean, I suppose that the government might say, well, I know what the government said because Kemi Badenoch has said, generally speaking, they welcome foreign investment and they think the Royal Mail needs to perform much better and needs to make more money. It's lost too much money in the past.
Well, we can't argue about the current state of their finances. They are in a difficult place. So one of the key questions will be, is this guy coming in to asset strip the company, or has he got a real plan for growing the business, growing services, investing in the workforce? That's the real debate. I mean, at the end of the day, the most important thing is that Royal Mail is successful in the future. We believe that needs a new business model, a public benefit style company where there may be workers, customers on various boards within the company, where remuneration for executives is aligned much more to the workforce and to delivering on quality of service and growing the business rather than cutting it. There's lots of things where the workforce have a stake in the business, a serious stake. A collective stake. So we've got lots of ideas that we want to put to Mr. Kretinsky, and we'll be talking to the government and the Labour Party about this as well.
Dave Ward there, General Secretary of the Communication Workers Union, giving us his thoughts on Wes Streeting, what he told me about half an hour ago, and indeed, well, even less than that. In fact, time flies on this show, or at least like it feels like it does. Angela Rayner's workers' rights plan, and of course what he wanted to talk about there, which is the Royal Mail and the potential sale of the Royal Mail to a Czech billionaire and his concern about asset stripping. If you have any thoughts on that, or indeed more generally about Labour's plans for the country as announced this week and whether they're enough to excite the country about the prospect of a Labour government, maybe you don't need to excite it. Maybe British politics, as it often can be, is simply disliking the one lot a little bit less than the other lot. Any thoughts on all of that? 0345 6060 973 0345 6060 973. Text 84850. A little bit later on in the show, we're going to be talking to the German ambassador about the situation in Georgia, arms sales to Israel, lots of other things as well. Still lots to come on Lewis Goodall on Sunday. The time here on LBC is 11:19.
This is LBC with Lewis Goodall.
21. Let's talk to David in Enfield about Labour. Morning, David.
Good morning, Lewis. Hope you're well.
Yes, very well, thank you. What did you make of what Wes Streeting had to say?
Well, I had to laugh at the pledge card because it reminds me of Ed Miliband's famous tombstone. Do you remember that?
Of course, yes. Hard to forget him.
Yes.
People keep trying to find out what happened to it, but no one's quite sure.
Well, it got broken up and ended up in a quarry.
Oh, sorry. Best place for it, probably.
Now, listen, these pledges, for me, it's far too general, and there are three key things missing. As far as I'm concerned, three key issues. The number one is housing. I spoke to Sadiq Khan on Speak to Sadiq last year, and I was complaining to him about the state of housing in Enfield. He had a lot of people living in temporary accommodation. And he told me it was the biggest problem facing London. In London alone, there are 150,000 people without a permanent home living in temporary accommodation. So he said that's the biggest problem facing capital. It's the biggest problem facing the capital. It's probably the biggest problem facing the country. And of course, you've got also, got people now having to renew mortgages who've got houses at these vastly inflated rates from 4 or 5 years ago. And then you've got a crisis in rentals. North London rents up in the last year 15%. It's just very available for rent. The second issue that is, I find very critical, is social care. There's no mention of social care. So Boris Johnson promised us in 2019 that he would come up with a comprehensive social care plan. We've now got 12 million people aged 65 or over, which is 20% of the adult population. 3 million of those are aged over 80. And these people, the older people, they need community care. Because they can't get community care where 100,000 care workers short, they end up bed blocking in NHS hospitals. They can't release them because there's nobody to look after them. So that's a major issue. And then the third thing is my elephant in the room. There is no mention of Brexit or our future relationship with the EU. What is Labour's plan?
To be fair, David, it would be quite a lengthy pledge card if it included all of these things that you're suggesting. I suppose the point is supposed to be brief and pithy.
No, but I mean, but it's a matter of, even if he said NHS, social care. You know what I'm saying?
I do. I mean, they will. I mean, I suppose they will say, look, as indeed West Streeting did say, they'll have a manifesto. This is not the summit or the limit of everything they're going to do, but it's just a simple first step statement of priorities.
No, but I would have thought for most people want a house to live in or an apartment to live in, the security of tenure, so their children can keep going to the same schools, they have an orderly life. I mean, I would think that is the critical issue facing the country at this point in time is that, surely, for the average family.
Yes, I suppose so. David in Enfield, grateful to you. Ben is in Clacton. Morning, Ben.
Good morning. Well, your previous caller just now covered a lot of what I was going to say. And you're right, it can't put all of that. And I know they intend to do that. I communicate with them quite a bit. I'm a member of the Labour Party myself. And the housing, social services, and I think they're wrong to have the National Health Service deal with home care. I think home care should be put back in the hands of councils and properly funded. Then they know the local population. It's much more efficient because I used to work within the area in the 80s. And recently when I retired, I took it up as a job just before COVID. And I had to give it up because they wouldn't protect me from the point of view of giving me a test, all that sort of stuff. So that needs to be sorted. Once these things are sorted out and they look at the productivity in the country and get that up, get the finance available to run all of these things and pay for them, then it will happen. I'm not against private business. I think we need private business. It's vital that we encourage private business in order to get the economy moving. And all of these things have to be done. But it'll take at least 2 terms. It'll take 1 term to sort out all the problems, sort out all the problems, at least. And it'll take it.
And that assumes that everybody is making this assumption, which is, I think, actually a mistake. That the Labour parliamentary situation will be a stable one. You'll have a big majority. I think people are underestimating just how many seats Labour need to win just to get a majority of 1.
Yes, because of the damage done by the former policies of the Labour Party itself. And the disastrous 4-election losses.
It's not been a good decade for the Labour Party.
It's amazing. I'm absolutely amazed that this person has actually ended up in a very short period of time.
Yes, but I think sometimes we forget how far the party has travelled in a relatively short period of time. And I remember when Starmer's first became leader and doing pieces about it then, people were talking about a 10-year project. They were talking about him as hopefully being a sort of Kinnock-type figure who could start to recover and then someone else would finish the job. And yet here we are.
Well, I think of Keir Starmer as Lazarus. With the raising of Lazarus.
I suppose there are worse biblical figures to be.
Well, you know what I mean, but the thing is, you know what I mean?
Of course.
For the Labour Party, and it's amazing what he's actually done in a very short period. And people sniping in the background, the people that failed for all that time, sniping at him in the background is not acceptable. It will obviously remain in the sands of time whether he does do a brilliant job, which I believe he will. He's got a great team behind him, and hopefully he will, for all our sakes.
Ben in Clacton, grateful to you. Paul is in Manchester. Morning, Paul.
Hi, Lewis. Are you okay?
Yes, well, thank you.
I'm ringing up because I feel like Labour's in a bit of a tricky situation at the minute, because if they have a manifesto like Jeremy Corbyn's, they'll get called. But at the same time, they've got a manifesto that's not very inspiring at the minute. And there's quite a lot of people in the shadow cabinet that aren't hugely inspiring, I don't think, either. So I actually will vote Labour, because anything's better than the Conservatives, or even worse, UKIP and all that. But I also am not going to vote Labour if Angela Rayner's not on the ticket for deputy leader. I've decided. In fact, I might not vote at all again, because...
Why is that, Paul?
Because Angela Rayner is so relatable. She's come up from nothing. I know.
She's from your part of the world?
She's from my part of the world. I know Wes Streeton's and Bridget Phillipson are from working class backgrounds as well, but they don't.
And Starmer himself.
And Starmer, but none of them have the relatable feel that Angela Rayner has. She's like everyone you meet in Stockport. Well, not everyone you meet in Stockport, but she's so identifiable in this part of the world. And like I said, it's strange because a lot of people seem to be out for her, but when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, everyone was champagne socialist, and now we've got someone who's genuinely one of us. And I think I wouldn't be able to. And then I just think, well,
what do you think about the fact that the papers go for her so relentlessly?
I think it's absolutely disgusting. It's just I don't get why they're doing it. It's and I think it's
almost like they probably think she's a bit of a threat.
Well, it'll backfire eventually, just as all these culture wars will, and that's where Labour's got an issue, because if they go too far thinking they have to be a bit like the right-wingers on these culture wars, it's going to backfire, because there's generational change coming. I see my nephews, my nieces, and they're totally different to even my generation, and I was born in 77, but they're not bothered about who's trans and who's in a mixed race relationship, and all these things that GB News and all that are constantly going on about. It's just, so I think...
Well, it's amazing, Paul, isn't it? I think people forget, talking about how things can change rapidly over time, people forget now that as recently as 2017-18, who was proposing gender self-ID? It wasn't the Labour Party, it wasn't the SNP in Scotland, it was Theresa May's Conservative government. That's how far we've changed.
Yeah, but that will come back eventually, because apparently it exists in one of the European countries. Is it Spain or Portugal? And there's not all this stuff out there. And a lot of trans people, they don't even want to. They don't even want to be in women's spaces. They just want to be trans in LGBT spaces. But I think Labour, as I say, I think they need to really tackle homelessness. Yes. I mean, I would charge whoever's in power fines for every single person that's homeless on the street. So that would really shape them. Do you know what I mean? Because I just think we need homelessness eradicating, we need poverty eradicating, we need to work out what's luxury in life and what's a basic need, and housing, food and all that. Transport even, they're on about transport. We've got Andy Burnham up here.
It sounds, Paul, like you've got a hell of a pledge card yourself. Labour Party should ring you up. Paul in Manchester there, grateful to you. You're listening to Sunday with Lewis Goodall on LBC. Coming up.
The Ivanishvili government is casting the West as adversaries. And that is a clear shift for Georgian foreign policy.
The future is at stake in the Caucasus country of Georgia following the passing of the controversial foreign agent law. We will discuss the situation in the former Soviet state with the German ambassador to the UK right after this. First, though, at 11:31, let's get the very latest LBC News headlines with Jenny Barsby.
This is LBC with Lewis Goodall.
As I said at the top of the show, I have, by some miracle, I half expected to be trying to get the guys here to book an emergency studio in Istanbul for a connecting flight, but by some miracle managed to get back very late last night from Tbilisi in Georgia, where I'm sure you will have seen extraordinary protest rallies taking place outside the parliament, night after night, week after week. Extraordinary number of Gen Z students, young people in particular, protesting, holding their EU flags aloft, their Georgian flags aloft, their Ukrainian flags aloft, protesting against the so-called Foreign Agents Bill that the Georgian Parliament, under its Prime Minister, has acted, saying basically that this is a bill, they call it the Russian law. The Russian law, because it is based on a law that Vladimir Putin implemented from the Kremlin, which basically is used to suppress its political opponents and to force them to register with the government, where they're getting their money from, all of these sorts of things. And so they think it is a slippery slope. And most of all, they are worried because they're so desperate for a European future, joining the EU, that this will imperil their country's accession to the EU. And the EU has been clear about that it would indeed do so. Fascinating story, fascinating country. Spent a few days there talking to some of the leading politicians as well. And one of the most disturbing things, as we'll discuss, is the sheer level of Russian propaganda and misinformation that is being pumped into the country. It is in so many ways the ground zero of some of that information war that is going on as a result of its proximity to Russia and history with Russia. One of the people I spoke to was Tina Bokuchava, who leads the United National Movement in the Georgian Parliament, basically the leader of the opposition in Georgia. This is for the Newsagents podcast. Earlier in the week, and she talking to her about the actions of the Georgian government.
The Ivanishvili government is casting the West as adversaries. And that is a clear shift for Georgian foreign policy. And, he, of course, has been trying to sort of shift public opinion in Georgia and change the hearts and minds of Georgians through this kind of anti-Western propaganda, this insidious, Russian type of messaging, which is right out of Putin's propaganda toolbox. But it hasn't happened.
And this is the thing that surprised me most of all, because the Georgian government has started to use the language of Putin directly. And not just the use of the language, but some of the terms and concepts as well. They've started to talk all the time about something that they call the Global War Party. They accuse this Global War Party, a sort of group of kind of shadowy figures, of manipulating the war in Ukraine, of starting the war in Ukraine, of manipulating the protesters, the students who are out there, pulling all of the strings, manipulating the EU, the US. But when you actually ask who this party is, it's not entirely clear. That's a question that I put to Mariam Krivashvili, who is from the ruling Georgian Dream Party. She's an MP for the Georgian Dream Party. And as I say, she defended to me the foreign agent law passed by the country's parliament.
All this is a perception, and today we are in an era where lots of the things are led by the perceptions. If we move from perceptions to the real words, and this is one of the most simple law I have seen during these 4 years.
When I asked her what the Global War Party is comprised of, who it comprises, she said, well, it's a little bit like the Freemasons, and the Freemasons potentially might be involved. And I said, well, anybody else? And she wasn't able to tell me. But she was absolutely convinced, she said, that it existed, all of the same. And this is what the government there is doing, time after time. It's saying to its more culturally conservative citizens, you've got to be worried about these people. They're coming for you. They're coming for your way of life. They're coming for your traditions. And that is the Putin playbook, and the one that we're seeing roll out across many of the post-Soviet states, including even some countries within the EU. Think of Viktor Orban's Hungary. Think of Robert Fico in Slovakia. Anyway, I want to talk to this and about this, and indeed many other things as well, with the German ambassador who's joined me in the studio now. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Pleasure to be here.
How concerned are you and your government about what is happening in Georgia?
First of all, let me really congratulate you on the program from Georgia, because it's very important to highlight the struggle of the opposition, of young people there. I think Georgia is at a crossroads. We are very worried about the developments. And as you very rightly said, it's Russian disinformation, but it's also an increasingly aggressive rhetoric against the European Union, against the West in general. But we have made the offer, we have given as European Union, Georgia, the candidate status, but based on 9 preconditions. And we can only hope that those who are in favor of a European future will be able, in the end, to get the situation and to change the situation in their favor.
Something that the leader of the opposition put to me, and indeed many of the other political figures on the opposition side, they want the EU, the West more generally, to sanction the Prime Minister, Inishvili, who is the patron, effectively, the owner of the Georgian Dream Party, billionaire, oligarch, and others around them. Is that something that the EU might consider, your government might consider?
We have so far not considered that step. I think we are looking now more towards the elections in Georgia, which will take place in October. And it's very important then, I think, for all the Georgians to take a decision about their future. But we are, because you asked that at the beginning, we are very concerned about the development and also the way Russia is influencing Georgian politics.
And indeed other countries, indeed even EU politics as well. The army of misinformation bots that are out there constantly trying to, I think, in a way that I think people don't necessarily appreciate is happening.
I think people appreciate what is happening now. I think it started with the influence of Russia when they tried to influence the US elections last time. We are very aware about Russian disinformation now with the European elections upcoming on the 9th of June.
You're concerned about that?
We are concerned about that. We just discovered that a Russian-run program in Czech Republic, Voice of Europe, was handing out money to right-wing politicians. So we are very aware and very cautious about not only cyber attacks, but also attempts of Russian influence over the elections.
And in Germany itself?
In Germany itself, the same. Yes, we have seen attempts, and currently the state prosecutor is looking into some of these cases.
We talked a little bit about Slovakia as well. Obviously, we saw Robert Fico being, well, it appears to be an attempted assassination attempt. Fortunately, the Prime Minister there appears to have pulled through the worst of it. Disturbing on the streets of, well, it wasn't on a European capital, but in a European country, an attack such as this.
Very disturbing. It shows that the danger of polarization, of populism. In Germany, we have had attacks against politicians during their campaign now for the European Parliament. We have seen that in other countries. All of that is a very worrying development.
So you think that what happened could be the result of political polarization within Slovakia and more generally?
It's definitely the result of polarization, and that's why I really found it very positive that the current president of Slovakia and the new one, Pellegrini, stood together, making an appeal to all the Slovaks to stand together and really defend democracy.
Because, I mean, when we're talking about polarization, what we're talking here is about, we have seen it in many of the Eastern European countries that join the EU. Something a little bit as I was talking about with Georgia, this talking about the enemy within, talking about cultural opponents and so on. That is a change in our politics in recent years.
That is something that we have seen. It has sometimes anti-Semitic tones, like Orban against George Soros and his influence.
Well, there's nothing the EU can do about it, is it? Once they're in the club, they're in the club.
They're in the club, but there are possibilities to act. So we had possibilities to stop European financing for the previous Polish government. We withheld funding for Hungary based on the deficiencies on rule of law, and we need to strengthen these instruments.
Let me just play you. I referenced it a moment ago, but I think it might be worth playing to you, Mr. Ambassador. This is the interview I did with the Georgian Dream Party MP, Mariam Krivashvili, say from Georgian Dream. And I asked her about this concept of the Global War Party, which, as I say, based on a Putin kind of misinformation tactic. This is what she said. Your Prime Minister has spoken of a global war party. What is a global war party?
Well, this is something which, do you believe about Masons? Freemasons, for instance, right. Those who we were hearing about them for decades, and who we were seeing that they do have the influence on world politics and everything. Today, when I am involved in foreign relations, and sometimes when I have the partnership, and then they say that, well, you are okay and you are doing well, but then there is additional voice.
So wait, sorry. So you think What are the Freemasons doing? You think the Freemasons are manipulating a global war?
I'm just comparing it as a personality. Like me personally, I'm comparing to it like Freemasons who are like a separate standing power who we do not know in person, right?
So who else? So the Freemasons, who else are there in the global? Because it can't just be the Masons. I mean, who else?
Masons who are having the influence, right?
Pretty extraordinary, Mr. Ambassador, isn't it? But the disturbing thing about that is that sort of that turn in politics, that politics of conspiracy and paranoia, it's becoming more common, not less.
It's becoming more common, and as you say, I mean, this issue with the Freemasons is obviously ridiculous, but it follows a rule book from Moscow, because Russia has been repeatedly trying to create the impression about dark forces influencing international politics led by the US. And we hear that in other countries. That's really part of the rule book of authoritarians and populists. And it creates uncertainty among the people.
Stay there, Mr. Ambassador. I think you're okay to stick around while we just go to a break. I want to pick up a few other international issues, not least, of course, what is going on in Israel at the moment as well. We're going to return with the Ambassador just after this. It's Lewis Goodall on LBC, and the time is 11:45.
This is LBC with Lewis Goodall.
Mr. Ambassador, I just wanted to talk to you about Israel. You'll have seen what Benny Gantz, the Israeli War Cabinet Minister, has said overnight. Said that he could walk out of the government because there is no plan for the post-war situation, no plan from the Israeli government as to exactly what Gaza will look like in the future. How concerned are you about that? I mean, he's right, isn't he? I mean, it's amazing that 9 months in, we have no sense from Netanyahu about any of this.
We also are asking for a plan, because a plan is the basis for a future political process. I think it's very important to understand that without a plan, we will not be able to advance on the two-state solution. We need a plan to work out how Gaza will be governed in the future, who will take over security responsibility, what will be the role of the US and of Europe, but especially also of the Arab countries. So a plan is urgently needed.
Germany, of course, has some leverage in this situation. You're the second largest arms exporter to Israel. Have you considered perhaps an arms embargo or reducing your arms exports in order to get a plan?
There are some myths about that, because our main arms export are submarines, so nothing that is really playing a decisive role in Gaza. But we use, I would say, more than anything else, the attempt to persuade and to convince the Israeli government.
The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute has said that between 2019 and 2023, Germany has exported 30% of Israel's arms imports have come from Germany. Just last year, you exported 326 million euros worth, a tenfold increase from the previous year. Okay, maybe some of that is connected with the submarines, but it's still significant. You are a major industrial military ally of Israel.
Yes, no, absolutely. And we delivered arms, especially after the terrorist attacks of Hamas, after the 7th of October.
But a lot of water has passed under the bridge since then.
A lot has passed. This year, I think the whole amount of arms exports was something around 30,000 euros. So basically zero this year. But, to go back to your question, the key thing is now really to engage the Israeli government, not only on the plan for the future, but mainly the humanitarian access in Rafah.
Would your government ever consider an arms embargo against Israel?
An arms embargo can only be the result of an analysis where we come to the conclusion that international humanitarian law is breached.
And you don't think
this is something that the US is doing?
Yes, the US thinks that.
The US looks into it, but it also comes to the conclusion that it is for us, all of us, close to impossible to come to.
With all those civilians dying?
No, it's absolutely shocking. The numbers are shocking.
With German arms, potentially?
I don't think that with German arms, but nevertheless, I mean, numbers are absolutely shocking, and that's why we definitely want to see humanitarian aid coming in and end the conflict. But let me say also, Lewis, we need to see the hostages released, and we need to see political progress.
But you're still happy to sell them arms?
As I said, this year, basically nothing.
Last year, a lot. Something a little bit happier. The Euros are coming up. I'm not a massive football fan myself, but obviously something I'm sure Germany is looking forward to. I just thought, as a German ambassador, it could be potentially quite awkward for you, couldn't it? Because we've got England and Scotland competing. Who are you going to be rooting for? I've even got some little producer here has passed me these shirts here, Mr. Ambassador. We've got an England flag here. We've got a Scotland flag here. If I were to hand you one of these, which of the home teams are you going to be rooting for? You can choose now.
Thank you. I will support Germany, obviously.
Well, yes, but let's assume Germany aren't in it because, of course, England or Scotland have beaten them by that point. Which of these shirts would you go for?
I think then I have to stay absolutely neutral as ambassador. But I'm really looking forward to the first match in Munich, which will be the opening match against Scotland.
And, of course, there are concerns, more concerns about the potential terror threat. Same with Paris in 2024, of course. How concerned? I mean, I've read that there are extra security measures being put in place. Should England fans feel comfortable and safe going to Germany this year?
I think they can feel safe because we have an international police cooperation. We have British experts, we have British police officers integrated into the German police. We have a unified center who works on the security. We will have fan zones in all the cities where English and Scottish fans will be. So there is a whole program around that to guarantee the safety and security of everybody coming. But obviously there is never 100% safety.
Miguel Berger there, the German ambassador to the UK. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We should turn now to wrap up the show with our political panel, which we do every week. And this week we're joined by Robert Shrimsley, who's chief UK political commentator for the Financial Times, and Annabel Denham, who's deputy comment editor at the Telegraph. Thanks so much for joining us. Annabel, first, this week's going to be dominated, or at least the early part of the week, by the infected blood scandal, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Of course, we've got the inquiry being published at lunchtime tomorrow. This has been years in the making, and the saga has been going on for decades. There will be many questions that will follow from this, not least how quickly the government will respond, particularly when it comes to compensation. This is obviously going to present difficulties for the Conservative Party when they will be wanting to make pledges of tax cuts going into the election, but will be expected to, of course, rightly fund compensation for the infected and the affected, the victims of this appalling scandal. And some estimates suggest it could be as much as £10 billion. Unfortunately, this is simply what happens when you have politicians repeatedly kicking the can down the road. In the end, it is somebody's responsibility, and it falls into the laps of Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt.
Robert, it seems, listeners might be forgiven for thinking, is there not an institution, British institution, political or otherwise, which doesn't seem to have been afflicted by some horrendous scandal where lots of innocent people have either lost their lives or been sorely affected by it in recent years?
Well, I think Annabel touched on this just the end of what she was saying. The key point here, to me, there are two scandals. There's the actual tragedy of the infected blood scandal, which hit a lot of countries. It hit France, Canada, Ireland, Portugal. Lots of countries got caught up in this. A terrible but honest mistake initially. And then you have the double scandal of the cover-ups. First of all, the effort to pretend it wasn't happening, or to get people to sign up for lesser compensation because without telling them the full possibilities coming their way in other illnesses, and then the constant kicking this down the road. So that in other countries, Canada, Ireland again, compensation was paid out far, far earlier. Royal commissions were set up, I think, in Canada in the 90s. So it's something about the way the British body politic, the civil service and governments, both Labour and Conservative, just push this away and say till it's far enough away that those who are culpable will not be in an active political career anymore. And I think that's the truest of all the scandals here.
And Annabel, they had the recommendation, as I was putting to Grant Shapps earlier in the show, since July 2022 from the chair of the inquiry to compensate people earlier because, of course, people are dying every week as a result of it, but it's only coming now.
Well, one of the great tragedies, of the many tragedies of this scandal, is the fact that many of its victims won't have lived to see justice being served. They say justice delayed is justice denied, but it really has been denied in the case of some of these victims. It's terribly sad. Now, if you listen to the families of those who were infected with this disease-ridden blood, they will actually say that it's less about the compensation than it is about the accountability accountability, the responsibility, the mismanagement, and ensuring that in the decades that this has been rumbling on, that changes have been made to ensure that similar mistakes won't be made in the future. And you talked about, what is it about perhaps British institutions that have led to this escalating to such a great extent. And I think a problem that we have with our nationalised healthcare service that you don't get in most other developed countries is that there is this tendency to close ranks. There is this tendency for there to be a revolving door, that heads never seem to roll, that it's politicians who take responsibility rather than perhaps the officials working in these bodies, the senior management of the NHS. And I think, it isn't just the infected blood scandal, but this week we had a really important inquiry from the APPG for birth trauma, looking into the way that women are treated when they're on the labour ward. And that comes after the Shrewsbury and Telford Ockenden report a couple of years ago. And Donna Ockenden, the senior midwife, is also now embarking on the largest inquiry into Nottingham Hospital and the way that women were treated there. And so you do see this constant pattern when it comes.
Well, a minute, Annabel. I mean, if that were true, then it would presumably we'd not be having the problems we have with Thames Water, which was being privatised. I think it's very politically convenient to say, well, it's because it's a nationally run thing. But the truth is, these problems run through institutions nationally run or privatised.
Well, it's about power, isn't it?
Problems in the private sector as well. As it happens, when it comes to Thames Water, it's been woefully mismanaged, obviously racked up enormous amounts of debt. But one of the key problems that I don't think gets enough attention is the failure of Ofwat, the regulator, because it sets various perimeters in which Thames Water and other water companies must operate, and that has partly allowed them to pump sewage into the rivers and so on and so forth. So, no, certainly lots of questions to be asked, but it does seem to me that the NHS really does fail to learn from the mistakes of the past.
Robert, Annabel, wish we had more time. My fault entirely for overrunning, presumably persistently and consistently. I can see the producer nodding across the glass. That is it from me. I'll be back next Sunday at 10 a.m. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player. You can also rewind and pause when listening live to LBC. And of course, you can listen to a wide range of podcasts, including The News Agents. And if you are really interested in this Georgia story, and it is a really, really interesting story, which is much wider than just Georgia, it's about international politics, geopolitics and politics here at home, you can go and listen to my special report from Tbilisi on the latest News Agents from Friday. Go and do it now. Download Global Player for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 3 on LBC, it's Carol Vorderman. But now it's time for Ali Mirage.
This is LBC with Lewis Goodall.